For a feature address this morning on how people understand economic policies, we are honored to have with us Professor Stefanie Stantcheva, Nathaniel Robes Professor of Political Economy, Harvard University, and founder, Social Economics Lab, who's joining us virtually from Cambridge, Massachusetts. To introduce her, please welcome Maslina Mansoor, Director of Corporate Support and Support Services, Khazanah.
Assalamualaikum and a very good morning, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, not forgetting those joining us virtually this morning. Welcome back to KMF 2022. As we have heard yesterday, countries around the world are facing headwinds from all directions. Among others, issues such as climate change, food security, the widening of inequality post-COVID-19 permeate our everyday lives. While these complex events pose clear risks to our general well-being, they also present us with the opportunity to reinvent and relook at how we can live sustainably with our future in mind. We will begin today's session with the best young economist of the decade. Our speaker is the Nathaniel Robes Professor of Political Economy at Harvard University and the founder of Social Economics Lab. She studies inequality, taxation, innovation, and how people understand economic policies. She recently wrote a paper highlighting how vulnerable groups from disadvantaged backgrounds were hugely impacted by the pandemic. She also co-authored another paper introducing a simple organizing framework for inclusive prosperity, all of which are very much relevant to this year's theme. Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to have Professor Stefanie Stantcheva virtually with us today. She'll be sharing her work in understanding people's mind, focusing on social mobility and equality, immigration, and intriguing topics of winners and losers in society. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Stefanie to this year's Khazanah's Megatrends Forum. Over to you, Stefanie.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I'm delighted to be presenting some of the recent work that we have done at the Social Economics Lab. So let me start by introducing a little bit the method that will be behind all the work that I will present. So the method is large-scale surveys, which is really a way to get into people's minds and understand better how they reason about important things. You know, surveys have been used for a long time and historically to measure variables which today we can see much better in administrative data or other big data. But there are things that remain completely invisible in other data. These are things like perceptions, knowledge, attitudes, and views. And these critical things which shape people's views on policies are what I want to explore here. And so the projects that I want to tell you about, really benefit from thinking about this following framework here that I have in mind. And actually, it looks like my slides are not reacting very well. So if you could possibly control them on your end, I will just say next slide. So next, thank you. So the framework that I want to think about is what is in people's minds when they think about policies, and particularly progressive policies, what you can call redistribution policies, like progressive taxes, social insurance, transfers to low-income families, etc. When we think about these policies, we typically form views on at least 4 factors. One is the perceived efficiency of these policies, which means whether their impacts on economic activity and on people's behaviors, for instance, on labor supply, on entrepreneurship, on savings, etc. The second thing we form a view on is what are their perceived distributional impacts? So in simple words, who wins and who loses from given policies? And then third, we form some views about our fairness concerns, which speaks to topics such as, for instance, how fair is inequality? Are people entitled to keep their income, or is it okay to tax it away? Is income the result of effort or luck, etc.? And then finally, another thing that plays a big role in this mental model that we use to think about progressive policies is our views of the government. How trustworthy we think the government is, how competent, and what its scope should be. Next slide, please. And if you want to summarize a little bit in a very schematic way, in many countries, how people reason about redistribution policy in general and tax policy in particular, I did a recent project where you can really say that there's sort of two groups of people that very much differ in their reasoning along all these dimensions. So if you want to summarize very briefly, if you are someone who's more on the economic left, who tends to be more left-leaning politically, you will think that taxes have smaller economic costs than someone who is on the right. On distributional concerns, you will tend to typically think that progressive things help lower income people. So for instance, raising taxes on top earners is never going to lead to trickle down economics. It's not going to benefit everyone. And then if you're on the right, you'll tend to believe much more that helping the rich, basically cutting taxes on the rich, is going to help everyone. You believe in trickle down. On fairness views, if you're someone on the left, you will tend to think that inequality is mostly unfair and that luck, which is things outside of your control, are quite important for determining whether you're rich or poor. If you're on the left, you'll tend to typically think that the government should have a broader scope and you trust it more as an institution. And then something interesting is that even if we go down to the basic level of what I call reality, which is things which are facts, like for instance, what is the top tax rate or how much inequality is there? We can see that people have different views based on their political affiliation, even about basic facts. So for instance, if you're someone who's more on the left, you will tend to think that taxes are lower and less progressive and inequality is higher than someone who's on the right. So we have all these different views on all these dimensions that sort of inform our views of progressive policies. And you may ask, well, which of these factors, given that we differ in all of these perceptions, which of these factors is in the end the most important one to shape our views on policies? And so next slide, please. What we can show with careful work is that in the end, what matters most is for people is who they think gains, who they think loses, and how fair they think that is. And this is very important because fairness is a very, vague concept, and it means different things to different people. As we say, fairness is in the eye of the beholder. And so what I want to focus on in the first part of this talk is actually three factors that really shape people's views on fairness, and basically, determine how much they're going to support redistribution policy or not. And these three factors that I want to cover are first, perceptions about social mobility and equality of opportunity. The second is people's views about immigrants, so those who are different from them. And then the third is people's perceptions of their own position relative to others. So it will turn out that these three factors are very important in determining what we think is fair or not, and how much progressive policy we support. And then I want to switch gears a little bit, and at the end of the talk, tell you about two other policies where fairness plays a very big role in what people think. And those policies are first climate policies and then trade policy. So we're going to cover a lot of ground. I'll be very quick on all of these points to hopefully convey a lot of information and a lot of findings to you here. So let's get started with the first topic on the next slide, which is social mobility and equality of opportunity. So the goal of this research was to test this theory that what you think about social mobility and equality of opportunity is going to be really critical for whether you support redistribution or not. The basic idea is that if you believe everyone has the same chances to start with, then you're much more willing to tolerate inequality because you think that the path, from everyone's chances to their incomes is more deserving, is more fair. On the other hand, if you believe that people did not start with the same opportunities, perhaps because they're born in families with different incomes, you're much more willing to act against inequality because you understand that the path from your own background to your income today has not been that fair. And so we set out to really test people's perceptions about social mobility and see how they relate to their views on redistribution. And so we do this in 5 countries here. These countries are the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, and Sweden. And so the first thing we want to do is to even check whether people have accurate perceptions about social mobility in their country. On the next slide, you can see how we elicit those views. Of course, mobility is a difficult concept to understand. So we want to ask in a simple way. And what we do here is to show people these two ladders. So on the left, we explain to them that this ladder represents the parents' income distribution. So we tell them to imagine 500 families that represent the US population, and we rank them from the 100 poorest to the 100 richest. And then we ask people, please consider 100 kids from the bottom rung of the ladder, and please tell us what you think these kids will do when they grow up. So on the right ladder, we have the children's income distribution, again, ranking from the poorest 100 to the 100 richest. And people have to say how many children they think will end up in each position. And what do we find here? Well, first, we can look at what happens on the next slide when we ask people, what are the chances of children staying stuck in poverty? So the way to read this graph is that each dot represents one country in the sample, and the horizontal axis shows us the real probability of a child staying stuck in poverty. So for instance, in the US, 33 children born in the bottom 20% families will remain in the bottom 20% families when they grow up. So you can see here that actually the US is the least mobile country among these 5 countries. European countries tend to have higher mobility. On the vertical axis, though, you can see the average perception of respondents in that country. And here you can see that the US is broadly accurate on that dimension, but European countries tend to be too pessimistic. So they tend to overestimate the chance of staying stuck in poverty. But what about another measure of mobility, which is this idea of making it from the very bottom to the very top? So that's on the next slide. Here we can see on the horizontal axis again, the actual chance of a child that's born very poor to make it to the very top. And you can see that the US again has the lowest mobility according to this measure. Around 7.5 kids from the bottom will make it to the top. In European country, it's around 11 children out of 100. And then you can again see on the vertical axis the perceptions, whereby European countries are again slightly too pessimistic, but the US is really over-optimistic. And so how does this shape people's views on policies? So that's on the next slide. We can see the link between perceptions of mobility and support for redistribution very clearly. So first of all, most people in all these countries are quite worried about a lack of social mobility and inequality of opportunity. So put differently, people think that if there's no equal chances for children, then that's a problem. However, the solution that people would like for that problem is very different and differs very much depending on whether you're politically left-leaning or right-leaning. In particular, if you're someone who's more left-leaning, when you think that there's lower mobility, what you want is more redistribution. So you want more government action. You want more progressive policies, like more progressive taxes, more social insurance, and more equality of opportunity type policies like education and health spending. And this is confirmed with an experiment. If you show people negative information about mobility, say to half the sample that's randomly chosen, and don't show it to the other half of the sample, you can see that people who see the negative information become more supportive of redistribution, but only if they're left-leaning. If people are right-leaning politically, then it's the opposite. Then they tend to consider that the government is part of the problem rather than the solution. So they believe that the better way to improve equality of opportunity is actually less government intervention and more free, economy, more business activity, etc. And so ultimately, these different solutions to the same problem can really be mapped to different attitudes about the government. On the next slide, we switch to the second big topic, which is people's views on immigration. So you may wonder, how does that relate to people's views on progressive policies? And it turns out that there is this theory that people, dislike redistributing when they think that it benefits those who are more different from them. So, for instance, immigrants. In a sense, generosity doesn't travel as well across national, ethnic, or religious lines as it does within. And so this is again about this important concept that's so critical for distribution policy, which is, who do people think gains? Who do they think loses? And how fair do they think that is? And so we set out to first determine, do people even have accurate perceptions about immigrants in their country? And how do those perceptions shape what they want on progressive policies? So on the next slide, you can see some of the key misperceptions about immigrants. So next slide, please. We can start with a perceived versus actual number of immigrants that people think are in their country. So here, the way to read this chart is that each row is one country. And so it's the same countries as before, but we have added Germany to the mix as well. And the blue diamond shows you the average number of immigrants in the country. And the red square shows you the average perception of people in that country. So you can see that in all countries, people really overestimate the share of immigrants by very important amounts. So people think there are many more immigrants than is actually the case. On the next slide, we can see something that's more closely related to redistribution, which is what is the share of respondents who will say that the average immigrant gets at least twice the amount of transfers of non-immigrants? Note that this is not true in any of these countries. So in no country does an immigrant get twice the amount of transfers than a non-immigrant on average. But a significant share of respondents think so. So people tend to think that immigrants rely much more on government transfers than is the case. And then on the next slide, you can see something that directly measures people's bias against immigrants. So here we describe to respondents two identical men who have the same income, the same family situation, the same job, etc. The only difference is that one of them is called Mohammed and is an immigrant, and the other one is called John and is not an immigrant. And we ask people, do you think that Mohammed pays the same taxes, more taxes, or less taxes than John? And does he get, less transfers, the same transfers, or more transfers than John? And the graph here depicts the number of respondents who say Mohammed gets more transfers and pays less taxes than John, which, based on the information provided, cannot be the case. The only accurate answer is the same transfers and the same taxes. However, you can see that in countries like the US, Italy, or France, a third of respondents will say that systematically an immigrant gets more transfers and pays less taxes. So a very stark misperception here about immigrants' economic contribution and reliance on government transfers. On the next slide, I sort of summarize some other perceptions or misperceptions people have about immigrants. And here again, we elicit this in great detail, but in the interest of time, just very simply, people most people within these countries tend to think that immigrants are economically weaker, more unemployed, less educated than is the case. They think they're more reliant on government transfers, and they think they're more culturally distant from them, for instance, of a different religion. And these misperceptions are true across the board, even though some people tend to be more accurate than others. And then on the next slide, we can see how this relates to people's views on progressive policies. It turns out there is a real link between support for progressive policies and the welfare state and your perceptions of immigrants. In particular, just making people think about immigrants by asking them questions about immigrants before asking them questions on policies makes them less supportive of progressive policies. So simply inverting the order of the questions and so making you think about immigrants has this strong effect on lowering support for redistribution. And what explains this, we can show with the data, is that the key perceptions that influence this link are whether people think that immigrants are economically weaker, so that they do not contribute to the country as much economically, and when people think that immigrants tend to free ride on the system and don't work as hard. And so these are the key perceptions that make people support less redistribution when they think there's more immigrants. So we can go on the next slide and then skip actually to the next project directly. Thank you. So the third important thing that shapes people's views on fairness is where they think they stand relative to others. And so this is something that turns out to be extremely critical for how fair people think inequality is. And so what do I mean by your position relative to others? Well, in principle, you can imagine people having many reference groups. I could be ranking myself relative to people in my neighborhood, my neighbors, or relative to people at my workplace, or people with the same education as me, or people in the same sector as me, or people born in the same year, people of my cohort. So these are all possible reference groups where I form some perceptions of how well am I doing in terms of income? Where is my income compared to these people? And so we wanted to see here, are people accurate in ranking themselves among others in these various reference groups? And how does that relate to their perceptions of fairness of inequality? So what we did was to run a big project in Denmark, where we were able to link people's survey responses to very detailed data coming from tax and social security data that lets us see not only people's whole incomes and their whole income history, but also the incomes and income histories of all their reference groups. So for instance, we know their neighbors' incomes, and we can see where do they truly rank among their neighbors versus how they think they rank, or where do they truly rank relative to people with the same education as them, etc. So an incredibly rich data that lets us truly see people's positions in many different groups. And so we ask people about their perceptions very carefully. So for instance, on the next slide, we first start by asking them whether they're aware of income levels of the different groups. So for instance, we ask them, we explain what we mean by the median income, which we call P50, and we ask them, what is the median income of people born in the same year as you? And so all the questions are adapted to each respondent. So here, for instance, we asked this respondent who's born in 1970, what do you think is the median income, the P50, for people born in 1970? And so they have to provide us with an answer. And then we also asked them systematically about other groups on the next slide. So for instance, we asked them, this person here is born in 1970, is a man, lives in Copenhagen. And so we asked them, what do you think is the median income for people in Copenhagen? What do you think is the median income for men born in 1970? People in your sector, this person works in finance and insurance. For people with your education level, this person has a master or PhD program. And then we also asked them about the top of the distribution. How rich are the top 5% richest people in those groups? So now we know what people imagine about the income distributions of these groups. And then we asked them, please rank yourself. Which position do you think you are in all these groups? And what do we find? So the main finding is on the next slide, which shows us on the horizontal axis, people's actual position. And let's pick one group to start with. So let's pick your cohort, which means people born in the same year as you. So on the horizontal axis, we have where you truly rank in your cohort. And then on the vertical axis, we have your view, your perception of where you rank. So what you can see is that people who are ranked lower in reality tend to overestimate their position. They tend to think they're actually ranked higher. And people who are ranked higher tend to think that they're actually ranked lower. So people have a systematic misperception. They tend to think of themselves as closer to the center of the distribution. And this is true for the cohort, but it's actually true for all other groups too. So if you go to the next slide, we can see the same graph for all the groups. So remember, we asked people to rank themselves in their cohort, but also in their gender group, in their municipality, in their education group, in their sector. And in all these groups, they have similar misperceptions. So people who are ranked lower really overestimate where they rank, and people who are ranked higher underestimate. So where does this come from? What drives this misperception? What can explain it? Well, we can actually show that it comes from systematically misperceiving others' incomes. So if you yourself are poor, you'll tend to think that everyone else is poor too. So in your mind, the whole distribution will be shifted to the left. And so you will think others are also with lower incomes. On the other hand, if you are someone who's rich, you will think everyone is richer too. The whole distribution will be shifted to the right in your mind. And this is why you will tend to rank yourself as lower, simply because you think there's other richer people out there. On the next slide, we can see also what types of inequalities people consider to be most unfair. It turns out that if you ask people which of these inequalities, so is it inequality within people with the same education, within people of the same sector or of the same age, etc., which ones are most unfair? it turns out that people think that inequalities between coworkers in a firm or in a sector, or between people with the same education, that those are the most unfair ones. And ironically, those are exactly the ones that are bigger than people think, those inequalities. These are exactly the inequalities that people tend to underestimate. So really, people are more accepting of inequalities that are conditional on factors that are considered to be less relevant for income, for instance, your city where you live, your age, or your gender, than of inequalities that are conditional on factors that we think are crucial determinants of income, like education, the sector of work, or the firm you work for. And on the next slide, we can finally answer this question of, well, how does your social position, your perception of where you rank relative to others, shape your views on inequality? And the key finding is really that people who are ranked higher in each group will tend to think that income inequality within that group is more fair. They will also think that income differences in that group are rather due to differences in effort, in things that you control, rather than in luck, which is things that you don't control, circumstances. They will also tend to think that high income earners deserve their income. They're more likely to vote for right-wing parties and to support lower redistribution. So your social position is really important to shape your views on policy and on fairness. On the next slide, we can also see that when your position changes in your life, because you experience negative events or positive events, for instance, unemployment shocks, health shocks, or a positive thing like a promotion at work, we can see that if you experience a negative event that shifts you down, you will think that inequality is less fair. On the other hand, if you experience a positive event that shifts you up, you'll tend to think that inequality is more fair. And finally, on the next slide, we also show people where they truly rank in all their groups. Since we have this information, we can do this little experiment where to half the sample, we will tell exactly where they actually rank in each group. And to the other half of the sample, we will not provide any information. And so we can compare what happens to the fairness views of these groups. And what we can see is that, for instance, this respondent here, if you remember him from the beginning, was born in 1970. And for instance, when we asked them to guess, where are you ranked relative to others born in 1970, they guessed that they were at position 70. So they were at the 70th percentile among others born the same year. Unfortunately, we have to tell them that in reality, they're only ranked at P57. So they're ranked lower than they thought. And when we tell them that, what happens? Well, you guessed it. When I tell you that you're actually ranked lower than you thought you were, you tend to think that inequality is now less fair. You'll tend to think that inequalities are more unfair, and you will not be as tolerant of inequalities. So these are basically three core factors: your perceptions of equality of opportunity and mobility, your views about others, such as immigrants, your position relative to others or your perceived position, and that really shape fairness views, which are critical for progressive policies. And in the final minutes of the talk, I want to switch to briefly tell you about people's views on two other policies where fairness concerns also play a big role. So on the next slide, we can talk about climate policies. So this is a project that we did in 20 countries where we really wanted to understand what shapes people's views on climate policies and what sort of information can actually generate support for more climate action. So to start with, on the next slide, we can actually establish one key fact, which is that if you ask people, is climate change a serious problem? And do you think your country should take measures to fight climate change? The main takeaway is that people across all the 20 countries will say strongly yes to both questions. So yes, climate change is a serious problem, and yes, our country should fight climate change. So clearly, people are already very worried about climate change, and they already want some government action. But so what determines the support for specific policies? Well, let's look into this. So first, on the next slide, you can see the sample of countries that we have in this project. So we have more high-income countries in light green, and we have more middle-income countries as well in darker green. This is just to give you an idea of all the countries here that we can survey. So it's a very big project in 20 countries. And I've summarized on the next slide the key findings of this project for you. So I think you have the old slides. Sorry. So if you just go a bit quicker, I'll tell you when to stop. Yes. Sorry for the slight technical problem, but we will get there. Yes, keep going. One more, stop. Yes, one back. One back. One more back. So yeah, perfect. This is right. Exactly. So what is the summary of our findings on climate policies here? Well, we find that there's 3 factors that shape how people, whether people support more climate action or not. And those 3 factors are, first, whether they perceive a policy to be effective in reducing emissions. Of course, this is not easy to understand. I mean, for instance, if I tell you there's going to be a carbon tax, the link between a carbon tax and an exact reduction in emissions and the impact on temperatures or on climate change is quite difficult to understand because there's many steps in that chain of causality. But so that is something that's really important. The more effective a policy is perceived to be, and the more support it generates. The second very important factor is the perceived distributional impacts on lower income households, which you could call an inequality concern. So again, think about the fairness views here. This is exactly where they enter. So people worry about whether lower income households will end up sharing a bigger burden than higher income households. And that matters as well, which means people will tend to support much more policies that are progressive, policies that they perceive, to be progressive, than policies that they think will disproportionately hit the lower income or the middle class. And then the third major factor that shapes people's support for climate action is their perceived impact on themselves. This is what you can call self-interest. So of course, it matters to people whether their household is going to be hurt financially or not. So for instance, people that tend to be more reliant on fossil fuel energies or on carbon, for instance, people that tend to drive a lot or that have no public transportation available or that have high heating expenses, of course, those people will tend to support, climate policies less because of that self-interest channel. So what we can really see is that these are the 3 key factors that shape people's views on policies. And that's also interesting because it tells us what is not so important. What we can show is that people's concerns or worries about climate change per se are not that important. In a sense, everyone is already quite worried about climate change. And so that's not really what's going to drive support for more climate action. And similarly, although people have very different knowledge about climate change, that knowledge is not significantly correlated with policy support either. It's really those 3 key factors that are very, very important. And when we can look at which policies are basically most supported, we can see that it's policies that are either perceived to be very effective. So for instance, targeted investment programs like in green infrastructure or in low carbon technologies, or policies that are perceived to be really progressive. For instance, carbon taxes tend to be quite supported if and only if you guarantee that the revenues will be used in a progressive way. So for instance, they will be used to give cash transfers to the poorest households or to vulnerable households. And then sometimes, because of this equity concern or inequality concern, people will tend to support more regulation rather than corrective taxation. So for instance, sometimes people prefer an outright ban on polluting vehicles from city centers or dense areas, or the mandatory insulation of buildings, which basically will affect everyone. It's either prohibition, everyone will be affected by it, rather than, for instance, a tax that will still allow higher income people to potentially pay to pollute. So in the interest of time, and because the slides seem to be slightly outdated, if we just go on the next slide, I will tell you the key findings about trade policy verbally. So hopefully you can just follow along with me. When it comes to trade policy, people have very complex concerns because people can perceive themselves as consumers. And as consumers, we potentially gain from trade through lower prices, through a higher variety. But people also view themselves as workers, as employees. And in that role, some people will lose and others will gain. It depends which sector you work in, how exposed that sector is to import competition and to trade, which occupation you're in, etc. And then it turns out people also have broader concerns. So on the one hand, they have efficiency concerns. They tend to consider that trade, for instance, will increase innovation, will increase growth. So people tend to believe in the efficiency gains from trade. But people also have equality concerns again. People understand that when there is more trade, there will be winners and losers. And it turns out that they really care about whether the losers can be compensated with redistribution policy. So for instance, if trade tends to hurt people in a sector, people will only support trade if they believe that there will be programs to help people in that sector, like retraining or transfers or help with finding new jobs. So a very, very important part of trade is that it has to go hand in hand with compensatory redistribution. And what we can see is that in general, sort of the strongest predictors of support for trade are basically whether people think that trade creates efficiency gains, like increases competition, etc. And many people believe in that. And also whether people think that losers can be compensated. So whether there will be sufficient progressive policies to compensate the losers, in the absence of which people will, have a backlash against free trade and will actually oppose free trade if they think that we're not helping people that are hurt by trade. And so what we can really see is that in general, our gains as consumers are not very salient to us. They don't really predict whether we support trade. We're not very clear how much we gain as consumers, but the losses in the labor market for us as workers or in our jobs, which are very concentrated and potentially very acute, those really, really play a large role. And so in a sense, the losers will be very concentrated and very acute, while the gains will be very diffuse and dispersed. And that's how people perceive it indeed. And so really, trade is again another policy where people's concerns about the impacts on different people and the equity issues are very much front of mind. And so I want to just end by thanking you. I hope this was an interesting sort of horizon tour of important fairness concerns that people have, and then progressive policies, climate policies, and trade policies. And I'm very much looking forward to your comments and to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefanie, for the insightful presentation. I'm very sure it has given us a lot to reflect on, especially our own views and perception of economic issues and policies. We'll now open the Q&A session. We'll start with the questions from the audience from the hall.
Morning. Thank you very much for that. Very interesting. Nice to see that even human behavior can be studied and you can, rationalize and so on and so forth. But just one comment. I think the studies was done on US, Italy, Germany, UK, and so on and so forth. Do you think it would be very different for Asians, for example, or Southeast Asians?
This is an excellent question, and I honestly wish that this could be done, on a larger scale, and that I had the capacity to do it on a larger scale. That's why I'm particularly excited about the climate change project, which is in 20 countries and covers, a much broader variety of countries, including Asian countries and African countries. But you're completely right. I mean, it would be amazing to replicate these projects in a wide variety of settings. And I can imagine that the core idea of, people care about fairness and who wins, who loses, is going to remain critical. In the end, even in the climate change project, we can see that this concern with inequality is very salient in many countries. So it is not just there in Western European countries or the US. So I'm sure that conclusion, will very much remain. But what is considered fair, and if we dig into, for instance, views of mobility or views about immigrants, or how people rank themselves relative to others and how much they know about that, I can certainly imagine that varying a lot across countries. And so I would be, extremely interested in seeing more work done in this, and hopefully our team can do a little bit more on that.
Stephanie, just a quick question here on the mobility question. I guess for a immigration-heavy country like the United States, there's always going to be a lot of mobility and economic gains shared between immigrants and natives. So did that study kind of like account for that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. In fact, you can see that the misperceptions about immigrants are quite shared in many countries, but the US is really the country where people overestimate mobility so much. And this is potentially linked to the history that is very different in the US from the Western European countries. And it's actually something I've been looking at with my co-authors at the moment, whether the history, you know, the US being a country of more immigrant waves coming in more recently, and then historically, how that has shaped people's views. And it turns out that it is indeed the case that immigrants that arrived in the US over many centuries actually experienced a lot of mobility. You know, they came extremely poor and then worked their way up historically. And so people who saw these immigrants, who lived in areas with more immigrants, are actually more likely to believe in mobility in even, you know, today's generations who had grandparents and great-grandparents live in these areas, still retain that notion of, you know, mobility is possible because they witnessed those immigrants. And that's obviously very different from the Western European history, you know, that historically did not see these huge influxes of immigration. And so that could potentially explain these views. I don't have the final answer, but that's certainly some part of the story.
Thank you, Professor. I may have missed something from your presentation. Just that how you deal with perception. Do you try to address this perception with policies or try to correct the perception and implement policy based on reality? Thank you.
Great question. So it depends a little bit on the project. So for some of the things I showed you, we try to provide, you know, accurate information. So for instance, one great candidate for that was the project on immigration. Given that people have such strong misperceptions, it is natural to want to provide the accurate information. So for instance, tell people this is the actual share of immigrants in your country, or this is where immigrants actually come from in your country. And so we did that in that project. And we actually find that information there has not much effect at all, which makes sense because the factors that predict people's, you know, lack of support for redistribution in relationship to immigration is not really related to the number of immigrants or where they come from, is much more related to whether they think immigrants, you know, free ride on the system and are economically weak or strong. But in other projects, we're actually interested in going beyond information. So I didn't have time to tell you about this in the climate change project, but there we actually try to explain to people how the policies work. So for instance, how a carbon tax with transfers would work, or how a green infrastructure investment program would work. And we explain to them what are the potential effects on emissions and on the climate, and what are the potential impacts on people with different levels of incomes, and what may happen to people like them. And we can see that this explanation, what I could call some pedagogical videos, those have a very big effect. So helping people understand how the policies work better, that has a strong effect on their support for those policies. What does not work at all, actually, is to simply tell people, you know, potentially disastrous consequences from climate change. So telling them, you know, these are the potential disasters awaiting if nothing is done against climate change, which, you know, is something that people are, as I showed you, already worried about. So that is not information that is effective. In a sense, people are already aware and already worry about it. And so that really tells us the effective information from a policy perspective is the one that explains how the policies work, who will be impacted, how effective are they, and what will be the effect on people's own household and budget.
Take one last question from the floor before we move over to the virtual questions. Thank you.
Hi, Stephanie. Thanks. On one of your earlier slides on immigration, you said that hard facts don't actually work as well and narratives actually work better. Can you elaborate more on that and what it means for policymakers and policy advocates? Thank you.
Sure. Yes, that was a great catch because I did skip that slide in the interest of time. So that's exactly right. So in the case of immigration, we have this these very stark misperceptions, as you see. And what we tried there, as I just answered also to the previous question, we first try to give people accurate information on like the share of immigrants or where the immigrants come from. And that has very little effect because these perceptions seem to not really matter much. And so the other thing we did was, well, since it seems to really matter to people how they think immigrants, free ride on the system or contribute economically, we tell people a story about a day in the life of a very hardworking immigrant. So an immigrant, who tries to work very hard and tries to get out of poverty and tries to climb the social ladder. And that narrative actually works much better. In a sense, it goes exactly against the narrative that people have in mind of immigrants not contributing or immigrants taking advantage of the system. So that is the sense in which I said, in the case of immigration, these pure hard facts, they are not really targeting the sort of key misperception and the key, false narrative that people have in mind. However, I don't think this is a general message that, facts never work. That's not true, because we can see that it clearly works in other, for other policies, for other domains that are not immigration. So one example is the climate change project, where explaining to people how policies work has a big impact. These policies are hard to understand. It's hard to appreciate what their distributional impacts will be, and actually making that clear to people and explaining their potential effectiveness can really improve support. So I don't think facts versus narrative is a general lesson. It kind of depends on the domain. And that's why I think it's very important to understand which domains are very prone to misperceptions, which domains are very open to information, where there's really value in trying to give more info, more pedagogical, explanations to help people understand the policies.
Are you able to see it? Who are the main consumers of your research, and how has it been applied in policy so far? Also, have you done research in Asia? What are some of the regional learnings?
Great. So the two-part question here. It's very hard to say who are the main consumers of my research, because once I put it out there on the internet, on my website, or publish it in journals, I don't really know what's happening with it. So I can only guess, that, it's read by other academics or it's read by policymakers. I cannot know for a fact. What I do know is that there is definitely interest in policy circles, and I'm very happy about that, about how people think, how people understand policies. That's become a key concern. And I see more and more policymakers paying attention to that and trying to dig into that sort of work, and sometimes even wanting to run, their own surveys to understand these things better. So I've done a bit of work with, the French government on that, and written some policy briefs and reports for them on various issues, trying to really say, this is what is in citizens' concerns. These are their constraints. These are their worries that need to be addressed. And I think this is incredibly important because, of course, we economists know some things and have some expertise, but really we can learn so much from actually listening to people's concerns, listening to people's constraints and worries and what they want and what their objectives are. I feel like that learning direction is so, so important. And that's what I'm trying to do with this work. And the other question about Asia, I think I already responded slightly when I said that much more work has to be done. These projects tend to be, for feasibility and funding reasons, done quite a lot, in countries that I'm more familiar with. But that's why I'm very excited about the climate change project that's done in 20 countries. And hopefully I can sort of keep branching out and keep covering more and more areas.
Stefanie, I guess that's all the time that we have today. Please join me in thanking Stefanie for taking time to be with us this morning.
Thank you all so much.